Want to know the basics of using a light meter? This video is for you. It will teach you the difference in exposing flash versus continuous light, mixing the flash and the continuous light, a working knowledge of the exposure triangle, setting up your light meter, how to meter a scene with 3 lights, a main light, a fill light, and an accent light, and developing a lighting diagram, plus more. Everything in this video can be done with the Sekonic L858D, L478D, or L308X, unless noted. First, let's understand exposure. Each of these images is exactly 1 f-stop apart, with the middle image being the correct exposure. So this simply illustrates visually what a stop of light looks like on this 3-light setup, which we'll break down later on. Now the image on the left is the correct exposure, and there is a 1-stop difference as we go to the right, and you see an image that is 5 stops underexposed. I want you to remember this 5-stop difference. We will talk about the significance of this later, but I want you to visually understand a stop of light. For instance, these patches on the bottom of the color checker are 1 stop apart. Bet you didn't know that. And 18% gray would be right here in the middle, if we were to add it in. 5 stops visually is a range in which we go from white to black, but based on the dynamic range of a sensor, we can get a broader range than this when we're lighting an image. But it is good to know when lighting a scene, or if you want your white background to look black. So now let's talk about the exposure triangle and the relationship of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So here, I have an image that is exposed only with flash. I'm gonna show what happens when I change only the shutter speed, then only the aperture, then only the ISO, when specifically using flash. So when I only change the shutter speed by 1 stop increments, there is no change in exposure. You see here at 1/125th of a second, 1/60th, 1/30th, 1/15th, 1/8th, and 1/4 of a second, there is no change. The modeling lights are turned off, and the lights in the room are about 6 stops below my flash exposure, even at 1/4 of a second. When using flash and only changing the aperture by 1 stop increments, there is a 1 stop difference. You see here at f22, f16, f11, f8, and f5.6, there is a 1 stop difference as I change the aperture and keep everything else the same. And the same thing happens when you change the ISO. You see here at ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400, and so on. So, when metering flash, only your aperture and ISO will affect your exposure. Well, not really, but I don't want to complicate this. But as you know, there are levels to this, so I'll complicate it for a minute. One of the only times shutter speed will affect your flash exposure is when the duration of your flash, meaning the time the pulse of light your flash stays on, is longer than your shutter speed. This could happen with a global shutter like the Sony A9 III, which has a really high sync speed, or if using some flash units at the top of their power range. A lot of flash units will even tell you what their flash duration is, or if you're using high speed sync. So if your flash duration is 1/200th of a second at T1, and your shutter speed is 1/250th of a second, your shutter will close while some of the flash is still on, resulting in a lower exposure. But now, back to a simpler place. And if you did want to measure flash duration, our 858 can do that as well. So now I'm going to be lighting using all constant lights, swapping out my Profoto D2s for Nanlite Forzas. Using a light meter made this swap easier than trying to redial these lights in by eye. Once we create a lighting recipe at the end of this video, you'll see why. So now using constant lights instead of flash, when I change the shutter speed by 1 stop increments, there is a change in exposure. You see here at 1/125th of a second, 1/160th of a second, 1/130th of a second, 1/115th of a second, and 1/8th of a second. So when only using flash, our exposure triangle is only affected by the aperture and ISO. When using constant lights, our exposure is changed by using aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, all 3 aspects of our exposure triangle. So now, what happens in a mixed light situation when we are using both flash and constant lights? First, I'm going to show you the results of using both. Then I'm going to show you the problem you may have not known you had. And then we're going to get into some light metering for sure. So this lighting setup consists of a strobe overhead as my main light and a Nanlite Forza 500 as my accent or edge light. For this first set of images, I'm going to turn off my modeling light and only use the flash and the Nanlite Forza 500 on the camera right to give an edge light. Now watch what happens when I change my shutter speed. At 1/125th of a second, you can see a hint of the Forza 500 on the background, but you could still miss it. At 1/60th of a second, it becomes more clear, and you can see the effects of it on the model's shirt, hair, and face. At 1/130th of a second, it's probably metering equal to our strobe light. At 1/15th of a second, it becomes much more dramatic. And at 1/8 of a second, it intensifies even more. And then at 1/4 of a second, it starts to completely blow out parts of our image, but really starts to feel like sun just blasting through a window. So you can see here with the modeling light off, the main light stayed consistent as our shutter speed changed because it was a strobe. But the edge light, there was a continuous light, it changed significantly as our shutter speed changed. Now I'm gonna do the same thing, but turning on the modeling light of our main light. At 1/125th of a second, the max sync speed of our camera, you barely see anything. But now when I decrease my shutter speed, you see more of the ambient light from the modeling light coming in and pretty much destroying the image. So now we have seen what happens when we only use strobe, when we only use constant lights, and when we mix both. Do you really have to worry about your modeling light affecting your exposure? In most instances, no. But in extreme situations, yes. For instance, the ProPhoto Telezoom is a very efficient and bright reflector. Shooting with it at very low apertures to get a shallow depth of field in studio may start to affect our exposure. So if you go from f11 to shooting at f2.8 with your modeling light on, you have changed your exposure by 4 stops. If only using flash, but this could really be 5 stops if your modeling light is on, because now it is starting to mix and affect your exposure. If you meter, you will never run into this issue because it is always a factor in both. And yes, if you're using something like a softbox, you probably never see this happen, but it could. It will affect your color as well. Both these images metered the exact same exposure, but the one on the right had the modeling light turned on and the one on the left did not. So you can see the warmth of the tungsten modeling light start to even affect our color. So if I'm shooting for a client that is very particular about color, I will use a color checker throughout so that I can negate these color shifts if I need to. Remember, these are improvements that slowly start to give you 1% more control here and there. When using softboxes, umbrellas, beauty dishes, and most standard reflectors, there is far less of a chance of having these issues. But remember the 5-stop difference we looked at before? Once your lights start to mix in that range, be extra careful. So let's go through the steps of taking a flash exposure. I'm going to use a Sekonic L858, which functions exactly like an L478 in this situation, and a Sekonic L308X if that's the meter that you own. So to take a flash exposure, first decide how you plan to trigger your flash. One way is to use a sync cord, which is more and more rare these days. The second way is to get a compatible radio trigger that goes into the back of the meter. There is a compatibility list in the description below. The L478 comes with a hardwired trigger for the different brands of lights, and the L308X isn't radio compatible, but all work with cordless flash mode, which we're going to describe. Cordless flash mode enables the meter to sense a flash firing and then give you a meter reading. So now we're going to take a flash exposure using cordless flash mode. This is compatible with any flash system or exposure meter. So first, I'm going to select the solo lightning bolt icon, and now I'm on the cordless flash mode screen. So I am going to set my ISO and then set my shutter speed. So when I measure the light, the meter tells me the aperture. So when I'm ready to meter, I'm going to hold the meter in place, press the measure button, the screen will dim, and the lightning bolt will flash, meaning the meter is waiting for a flash. Then I will trigger the flash on my remote trigger, and the meter will let me know how powerful my light is. So now you will turn the power of your light up or down using the remote or the actual light itself to achieve your desired aperture you're looking for. On the L308X, you simply press the mode button until the solo lightning bolt is selected, then select your ISO and shutter speed, and then press the measure button. You will see the box over the lightning bolt blink, and then you can trigger your light using a remote in your hand or on top of the camera. Here I got a reading of f8 and 0.8 of a stop. Now, let's go through the steps of taking an ambient light exposure. So on an advanced meter like the L858 or L478, you can choose shutter priority, in which you dial in the shutter speed and ISO, and the meter tells you the f-stop. When using aperture priority mode, you put your aperture and ISO and the meter tells you the shutter speed. And in shutter speed and aperture priority mode, your meter will tell you your ISO. On a basic light meter like the L308X, it will only give you the aperture priority and shutter priority, meaning you will always need to plug in your ISO. Once you've taken an exposure reading, you can switch between these modes and use your meter like your exposure computer to quickly know how to change your ISO, shutter speed, or aperture based on changing any of these settings as part of your exposure triangle. So here you can see as I change my shutter speed, the meter is telling me how to adjust my aperture. So I don't have to do this math in my head. So now that we understand the basic functions of a meter, let's meter a scene and then create a lighting diagram. This is really where the magic happens. I'm starting with the settings on my meter at a base ISO of 100 and a maximum shutter sync speed of 1/125th in cordless flash mode. I'm going to set my main light, which is a Profoto telezoom reflector. I meter up and down my model to make sure the light is falling off as it's going down and isn't brighter on her chest than on her head, a mistake I see a lot of people make. Then I'm going to set my fill light. Sometimes if I'm going to be standing in front of my fill light, I'll give the meter to my model to hold while actively in cordless mode and take meter readings while I stand in front of the light to factor in the light I'm blocking. Then I'm going to set my edge light. I'm going to use a flag in order to get this slash of light on the background and flag her face from getting too much light. So I could have gotten to this point without using meter whatsoever. Sometimes we simply need to play, shoot, and make small changes based upon what our eye sees and what looks the best. It's not all about the numbers, but once you have taken all the time to shoot and adjust and to get to your happy place, then you can take the meter readings so that you can more easily get the same lighting setup dialed in later on. So I used to draw out a diagram on paper, but I found it much easier to take a photo and draw it in on an app. For this, I use an app called Notability, or you could simply take a picture on your phone and bring it into Photoshop and draw the distance of the lights to my model after measuring them with a measuring tape and writing down the f-stop of each of my lights and what they metered at. This way, I never have to second guess how I lit something, and you can develop your own lighting recipe guide to share with friends or sell your lighting diagrams online. Links to everything I used are below. And as you know, there are levels to this. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, and also check out my playlist to similar videos I've done. Right now, I have about 22 other videos on Adorama TV that you can check out that are very similar to this one. Very informational and everything designed to help you level up your lighting. Because as you know, there are levels to this.